I never imagined my own family could push my son into a nightmare like this. What should have been a normal day on vacation turned into a chilling betrayal. They left him behind, no passport, no phone, in a dangerous country that even governments warn against. I saw the pure terror in his eyes as he was abandoned by the very people he trusted most. This wasn't carelessness, it was a cold, calculated act of family revenge. If you think this is just an ordinary family story, you're wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the most shocking and compelling stories we have to share. I used to believe that blood would never betray blood. That no matter how strained things got, how sharp the words became, how cold the silences grew, family could never truly harm each other, especially not a child. But that illusion shattered the day my son Caleb sat on the cold stone floor of a foreign train station clutching a plastic bag and a fake passport waiting for a family that would never come back. My name is Liana Matthews. I'm 37 years old, a high school English teacher, a mother, a woman who once mistook endurance for love and silence for peace. I raised my son alone since he was 5, after his father decided parenting wasn't compatible with his need to find himself in Bali. And though Caleb never had a traditional family, I did everything in my power to give him safety structure and a sense of belonging. I worked nights grading papers, skipped lunches to save for his school trips, and told myself that my parents and my brother would eventually come around. That they'd see Caleb not as the weight of my divorce, but as a boy, smart, kind, full of potential. They never did. My parents, Ellen and Robert, grew up in a different era, the kind where a woman's worth was still measured by her husband's paycheck and her ability to bake casseroles without complaining. When I left my husband and chose not to remarry, I became something like a walking disappointment to them, polite at Christmas, tolerated at birthdays, but always the shadow of what could have been. Their affection, once so freely given when I was the obedient daughter, shifted subtly to my brother Derek and his picture-perfect family. He gave them what I didn't: a corporate job, a stay-at-home wife, 2 children with golden hair and clean shoes. They adored him. Derek, oh Derek. My older brother, by 4 years, vice president of a logistics firm, amateur wine snob, full-time expert in pointing out my flaws with a smile. He married Leona a decade ago. She was everything our parents worshipped: soft-spoken, elegant, always dressed like she'd stepped off a magazine cover until the doors closed and her tongue sharpened like a blade. Leona didn't even pretend to like me. She made no secret of her disdain for my clothes, my career, my parenting, and most of all, my independence. Her favorite line at family dinners was, "Liana always needs something to prove, doesn't she?" I never responded. I smiled, bit my tongue, told myself Caleb didn't need to see his mother fall apart. But what I didn't realize, what I refused to let myself admit, was that silence didn't protect him. It made him a target. That summer, the message came via group text. A bright, cheery image of palm trees and turquoise water with a caption from my mother, 40th anniversary trip. The whole family together again. Pack your bags, we're going to Southeast Asia. I stared at the screen, blinking. My parents, who hadn't invited me to Thanksgiving the year before, now wanted me on a 10-day international vacation. I waited for the catch. It arrived 3 messages later. Derek flights booked. Caleb's ticket included. Hope he can keep up with the big kids. I showed the text to Caleb, who immediately lit up. "Mom, we're going. We've never left the country." He spun around the kitchen, excitement bubbling over. I wanted to say no. Every instinct in me hesitated. But then I saw his face, his hopeful, desperate belief that maybe, just maybe, this trip would change things. That he'd finally feel like he belonged. I said yes. Over the next 2 weeks, I pushed down every uneasy feeling that rose in my chest. I told myself I was being paranoid, overreacting. I ignored the way Liana didn't respond to any of my messages about packing details. I brushed off my father's comment at brunch. Just keep your head down and don't start any ideological debates while we're overseas. All right, like I was some unruly liability that needed to be monitored. But the worst moment came 2 nights before departure. I was standing in my parents' backyard after dinner, the kids chasing fireflies, when Derek approached with a glass of wine, and that look he always wore when he was about to say something cruel in a calm voice. "You know, Lee," he began, "this trip is a good opportunity for Caleb to, I don't know, toughen up a little." I frowned. Toughen up? He's a sweet kid, but he's sheltered. Doesn't take risks. Doesn't really connect with the other cousins. He swirled his glass like he was stirring venom into it. "You've built a little bubble around him." "Because no one else helps protect him," I snapped before I could stop myself. He smirked. "Maybe. Or maybe it's time he learns to stand on his own." I wanted to scream. But Caleb was nearby, laughing as he held up a glowing mason jar. I smiled instead. Forced. Hollow. Then I excused myself to the bathroom and cried into a hand towel with lavender embroidery. Looking back, I realized the trip wasn't an invitation. It was a setup. They didn't want reconciliation. They wanted confirmation. They wanted to prove once and for all that I was the outsider, the liability, the one too emotional to handle real life. And they wanted to use my son, my only child, my everything as the test subject in their cruel little experiment. But I didn't know that then. So I packed our bags, bought Caleb a new camera for his journal, printed copies of our passports, marked our luggage with color-coded tags. And on the morning of our departure, I kissed my son's forehead and whispered, "This will be good for us." I didn't know I was walking straight into the storm. The day of our departure began with Caleb waking me up at 5 in the morning, fully dressed, wearing his backpack in the kitchen as he microwaved leftover pancakes. He looked like he was vibrating. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, grinning. "We're going to Asia, Mom." Asia. His voice cracked with excitement. His eyes sparkled. He'd spent the entire week researching the country, watching travel vlogs, learning a few phrases, asking me how to say thank you in 3 dialects I didn't even know existed. And I smiled, because that's what you do when your child is happy, even when something deep in your chest won't let you relax. I should have trusted that knot in my gut. We arrived at the airport 3 hours early. I wanted the buffer. I wanted to check the documents again, the passports, the boarding passes, the embassy contact card. I slipped into Caleb's shoe just in case. He laughed when I did it. "Mom, no one's going to steal me," he said. But that was the thing, I wasn't afraid of strangers. I was afraid of the people I shared DNA with. When we met the rest of the family at the terminal, they were already clustered together near the check-in counter, like a curated photo, my parents dignified in their matching travel scarves. Derek dressed like a catalog dad in his wrinkle-free khakis and blazer. Liana sipping an oat milk latte from a glass bottle, not a hair out of place. And their 2 teenage children, Grayson and Brielle, lounging on suitcases like models waiting for a brand deal. My mom barely glanced at Caleb before turning to me. "You made it early," she said like it was a miracle. "I like time to breathe before international flights," I said. "There's a lot to navigate, always with the worrying." She dismissed my tone with a wave of her hand. "Don't make this into one of your projects, Liana. It's a vacation, not a classroom crisis." I clenched my jaw. "I'm just making sure Caleb has everything he needs. He's never traveled internationally." "Well, neither had you until college, and you didn't need a binder full of instructions." That was her way. She never raised her voice, just chipped away with tiny, precise strikes until your sense of self cracked quietly without anyone hearing. I turned to Caleb. "You got your passport?" He patted his hoodie pocket. Triple checked. And your copy in the hidden pouch. Yup. Emergency contacts in your phone. Already starred and favorited. Leona, standing nearby, let out a low chuckle. You act like we're dropping him into a war zone, Liana. It's a beach resort. I didn't answer. Because no one else saw what I saw. Not the glances exchanged between Derek and Leona when Caleb approached, not the slight sneer in Brielle's smile when she offered to show Caleb how real teenagers vacation, not the way my father avoided making eye contact with me completely like I'd already done something wrong by arriving prepared. The tension grew sharper as we moved through security. Leona took control of the check-in process, handing over a neatly organized stack of everyone's passports except mine and Caleb's. When the clerk asked if we were with the Wilson family group, she didn't even look back at us. They're separate, she said. Separate! We boarded the plane in awkward silence. My parents had splurged on business class for themselves and Derek's family. Caleb and I were in economy. Just didn't make sense to spend so much for two people who don't even drink wine, my father had said. And we thought you'd want more space between you and the group for your independence. They weaponized that word like it was an insult. Caleb didn't seem to care. He was too busy geeking out over the seatback screen and the international flight map. We're actually doing it, he whispered. This is going to be epic. I smiled at him and tried to believe it too. We landed 14 hours later, bleary-eyed and swollen-ankled. The air was thick with humidity and foreign sounds. Caleb clung to my side as we exited the terminal, his fingers twitching with anticipation. I saw the Wilsons ahead already gathering by a private van, laughing, looking perfectly at ease. Come on, I told him. Let's catch up. Derek turned when he saw us approaching. He grinned. You ready, little man? Time to taste some freedom. Caleb blinked. Freedom? Yeah. First time outside your mom's bubble, huh? He laughed and ruffled Caleb's hair with the casual dominance of someone who never asked permission. This trip's gonna change you. There was something unsettling in his tone. Like this wasn't about experience, it was about proving something. Leona added, Don't worry, we'll keep him from getting too lost. Right, Brielle? Brielle smirked and pulled her sunglasses down. Sure, we'll teach him the ropes. I tried to laugh it off, but I caught the look Leona gave me, sharp, knowing-edged in something that felt closer to cruelty than camaraderie. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. My mother brushed past me with her carry-on. Stop fretting, Liana. You're going to spoil it for him. Let the boy breathe. I looked around. We were in a country where I didn't speak the language, didn't know the streets, didn't trust the people who shared my blood, and my mother was telling me to let go. But I said nothing, because Caleb was smiling, and I didn't want to be the reason it stopped. Not yet. The resort was everything the brochure promised. Sun-soaked terraces, marble floors cool beneath bare feet, and glass doors that opened to sweeping ocean views. Caleb stood at the window of our room, pressed up against the glass like he was trying to absorb every grain of color, every movement of the waves. His awe was real pure. He turned to me and said, It's like being inside a postcard. I smiled, but there was a weight sitting between my ribs that no turquoise sea could shake loose. We had barely finished unpacking when there was a knock at our door. Caleb opened it before I could get up. Derek stood there in aviator sunglasses and a white polo, looking like someone auditioning for a yacht commercial. Behind him, Brielle scrolled her phone, her expression bored, and Grayson leaned against the doorframe chewing gum with disinterest. We're hitting the town, Derek announced. Local market, some street food, maybe even the temple. Kid stuff, you know. Figured we'd take Caleb with us. Caleb lit up instantly. Yes, please, Mom. I looked at Derek, then at my son. What exactly is the plan? Derek shrugged. Don't worry. We've got this. He'll be safe. We're not wandering into any black market organ trades. That's not what I... Relax, Lee, he cut me off. Let the boy breathe. Leona appeared behind them, stepping forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. We'll keep him close. You go get a massage or whatever moms do when they're not supervising everything. I opened my mouth, then closed it. Caleb was already slipping on his sneakers. Passport stays with me, I said firm. Of course, Derek replied. I handed Caleb a copy of his passport and the emergency contact card. Keep this on you, and keep your phone charged. Text me every hour. He grinned, kissed my cheek, and was gone. I stood in the doorway long after they disappeared down the hallway, watching the empty space where my son had just been. Later in the lobby, I approached my mother, who was sipping tea and reading a paperback like she was on the cover of a cruise magazine. Do you know where Derek's taking them? I asked, voice carefully neutral. She didn't look up. Out, exploring, like normal children do. I just want to make sure. She closed her book with a sigh. Liana, you've always done this. Hovered, panicked, controlled. It's no wonder the poor boy can't make friends. That's not fair. It's not about fair. It's about facts. And the fact is, Caleb is 14, not 4. Letting him go to a market with his cousins is not an international crisis. But I don't know where they're going. You never do? She said quietly with a smile that was meant to look maternal, but felt more like a knife. Because you don't trust anyone but yourself, not even your own family. I took a step back. It's not that I don't trust people. It's that I know what they're capable of. She raised an eyebrow. Maybe that's what scares you most. I walked away without replying. Because if I had stayed, I might have said something I couldn't take back. I spent the next hour wandering the resort like a ghost. I checked my phone every few minutes. No texts from Caleb. At first, I told myself he was just caught up in the excitement. Then I told myself he'd probably run out of data. Then I told myself to stop being ridiculous. At 2:18 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was Caleb. Hey, Mom, can't find them. At train station. Think they left me. No joke. My blood went cold. I hit call immediately. No answer. Tried again. Straight to voicemail. I typed frantically. Which station are you okay? Stay where you are, I'm coming. There was no reply. I ran. Through the lobby, past the front desk, down the stone steps and into the street where the taxi queue buzzed with horns and heat. I pulled out the resort map, scanned for transit lines, circled the 2 nearest stations, and shoved it in my purse. The first taxi didn't understand me. The second did, barely. Train station, I said, showing him the marked location. Fast. We sped through traffic horns, blaring vendors shouting from sidewalk stalls. I stared at my phone like I could will another message into existence. Caleb, where are you? We arrived at the first station. I jumped out before the car fully stopped running through the sliding glass doors, heart pounding like war drums in my chest. I called again. Voicemail. I showed the ticket agent a photo of Caleb. Have you seen him, this boy? American. Alone? He squinted, then pointed down the corridor. I followed, breath shallow, eyes searching. And there he was, sitting on the floor near a vending machine. Backpack crumpled beside him, shoulders slumped, his phone dangling in his hand like it weighed too much to hold. He looked up and saw me, and his face broke, not into tears but into relief, raw, violent, bone-deep relief. I dropped to my knees in front of him. Are you okay? He nodded barely, then shook his head, then whispered, They left me. Mom, they left me. I wrapped my arms around him, holding on like he might disappear again. Because this wasn't just a mistake. It was the beginning of something far worse. The first 10 seconds after I found the train station empty were made of static. My brain short-circuited. No Caleb, no familiar faces, no message waiting to explain the silence. Just an echo of travelers' footsteps and the distant hum of arriving trains. I spun around like maybe I had missed him somehow, like he was hiding behind a pillar playing a game we never agreed to. But I knew. The moment I didn't see him, I knew something was wrong. I pressed his name on my phone and hit call. No answer. Again. Voicemail. Again. And again. Panic, when it comes, doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers slow and sickening, curling around your lungs and stealing your breath without warning. I stumbled back outside the station and flagged down a cab with shaking hands, my voice strangled when I said resort. Fast. The return felt longer than the ride out. I watched the blur of street markets and tuk-tuks fly past the windows like a movie I wasn't part of. I kept refreshing my phone screen. Nothing. Still nothing. When I burst through the hotel's front entrance, the concierge jumped at the sight of me. "Have you seen my son?" I asked breathlessly, showing a photo of Caleb on my lock screen. "He's 14. He was with his uncle and cousins this morning. Derek Wilson. Tall, white, expensive everything. Did they leave with him?" The concierge blinked, then exchanged a glance with the front desk clerk. "Ma'am." "Yes, I believe your son left with 2 adults early this morning, around 800. "No," I snapped. "That's not possible. He texted me from the train station after noon. He said he couldn't find them." She frowned. "I saw them leave together. The boy, he had a backpack." "Did they speak to the front desk?" "No. But the security guard helped them with a car." I turned sharply. "Where's that security guard?" 10 minutes later, I stood in the staff corridor near the loading zone. The guard, middle-aged, soft-spoken, nodded when he saw Caleb's photo. "Yes. He was with a man in sunglasses and a woman." They got into a silver van headed toward the city center. "What time?" "Maybe 7:45 before breakfast service." I stared at him. "Before breakfast, are you sure?" He nodded. Caleb had been gone longer than I thought. I didn't remember the moment I stopped breathing, only the moment I realized I'd started again, when the rush of adrenaline hit like cold water. I pulled out my phone and started calling. "Derek," straight to voicemail. "Liana." No answer. "My father," voicemail. "My mother." Rings twice, then silence. "Grayson and Brielle," nothing. It was like calling into the bottom of the ocean. I marched to the hotel's business center and demanded the manager. His name was Jay. Young, professional, too calm for what I needed. "My son is missing," I told him. "He was seen leaving this hotel with 2 adults around 800 a.m. He's 14. He texted me from a train station. He says they left him, and now no one is answering their phones." Jay's expression shifted from neutral to concern in seconds. "Ma'am, do you believe your son has been abandoned?" I didn't hesitate, yes. He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed. "Local authorities," he said. "We're reporting a missing minor." It felt like glass cracking beneath my feet. With each word, American teenager last seen with relatives, texted mother from a public transit station, the reality I had refused to accept took shape. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a prank. This was an act of violence wrapped in a family's fake smile. Within 30 minutes, a uniformed officer arrived with a translator. They ushered me into a small, unmarked room near the service hallway. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead as I recounted everything: the family dynamics, the trip's purpose, the way I'd been dismissed, the missing messages. The officer asked, "Do you have proof that the child was deliberately left behind?" I showed them the texts. The last one still on my screen. "Mom, can't find them. At train station. Think they left me. No joke." I played the message I'd recorded from the security guard. They nodded, took notes, made copies. Then came the question that made my heart break in a new direction. "Does the boy have his passport?" "No," I whispered. I had it. I kept the real one with me. Caleb had only been carrying a copy. "Then he cannot prove identity," the officer said. "This could be dangerous." I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. It was 3:17 p.m. My son had been without a guardian, without identification in a foreign city for over 6 hours. I was the only one looking for him. And the people who are supposed to love him most had vanished like cowards into the day. "We need to check train stations," I said. "Surveillance. There must be footage." "We will begin the process," the officer replied. "But you must prepare. It may take time." "I don't have time." "We will do our best." I nodded numb, then walked out of the office into the burning sun. Somewhere in this city, Caleb was alone. And whatever faith I had in the word family had just been reduced to ash. The surveillance footage didn't lie. It never does. It was 10:42 a.m. on the station's timestamp. The camera was angled slightly downward, capturing a wide view of the departure concourse. Streams of people passed in every direction, families tugging suitcases, businessmen in pressed suits, children chasing each other with ice cream cones melting in their fists. And then there he was. Caleb. My son stood just off center of the frame, his backpack slung low, his baseball cap turned backward like always. He was looking around, turning in slow circles like someone trying to find a familiar face in a crowd that refused to stop moving. He wasn't crying, not yet. But his hands were clenched tight, his body language stiff and uncertain. In his right hand, he held something pale and rectangular, a large manila envelope. I pressed pause. "What is that?" I asked the officer beside me. He rewound 10 seconds, hit play. This time I watched the moment the envelope was handed to him. From off-screen, Derek's arm entered the frame, watch bracelets, wedding ring, placing the envelope into Caleb's hands like he was giving him a gift. Then Derek turned and walked away. No hug, no goodbye, just gone. Liana followed behind him, sunglasses on, not once glancing back. And there was Caleb staring down at the envelope like it had just detonated in his chest. I covered my mouth, fighting the bile that crept up my throat. The officer paused the video. "I need to see what's inside that envelope," I said. We were back at the hotel by the time I convinced Caleb to let go of it. He was curled up on the edge of the bed in our room, arms folded across his chest, jaw locked. "It's okay," I told him gently. "You don't have to say anything yet. Just let me look." He nodded once, eyes glazed. I peeled the flap open slowly. Inside were 4 things. First, a stack of local currency about the equivalent of $20. Barely enough to get across the city, let alone survive a day. Second, a map of the metro system with 2 stops circled in red. Third, a folded-up page torn from a hotel notepad. 5 words scrawled in Derek's handwriting. "Learn to survive, not like her." And fourth, a passport. At first, I almost sobbed with relief. But the weight was wrong. The edges too sharp. And when I opened it, the truth stared back at me in blocky counterfeit print. It was a fake. Not just expired, not just altered, a complete fabrication. The photo of Caleb was one I recognized his 7th grade school picture, but the rest of it was a bad copy of an official document. The ID number wasn't valid. The hologram was missing. The stamps were nonsense. They had left him with fake documentation. They had stripped him of his identity. I walked into the hallway, my fingers trembling, and called Officer J. "I have the passport," I said, voice flat. "It's not real." There was a long pause. "Then I'll be there in 20 minutes. We sat in the hotel business lounge under dim lights while he examined it. Another officer joined him, older, more senior. They whispered in their language for several minutes while I held Caleb's hand beneath the table. Finally, the older one spoke. "This is not only irresponsible," he said, "but criminal in nature. You understand this?" I nodded. He continued. "This could be treated as child abandonment under international jurisdiction, especially with falsified documents. Your son was left in a public space underage without legal identification." "What happens next?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. "That depends on you," he said. "You can press charges. It will take time. It will get complicated. But we will support you. We will also notify the American consulate." I glanced at Caleb. He was staring at the table, expression unreadable. "He's just a boy," I said. "He didn't deserve any of this." The officer nodded solemnly. "No child does." As the 2 men left to draft the official report, I leaned over and touched Caleb's cheek. "You okay?" He blinked, then nodded. "It's just weird," he said. "It's like they made me disappear, like I didn't exist." A lump formed in my throat so sharp I almost couldn't swallow. But he was right. That's what this was about. Erasure. Not punishment, not correction. They wanted to delete him. to erase my son from the narrative of their perfect family, to teach both of us some twisted version of a lesson. And in their arrogance, they thought they'd get away with it. They didn't realize they'd picked the wrong mother. Because I was no longer just afraid, I was furious, I was focused. And I was going to make sure this story didn't get swept under the rug like every other family sin they'd ever buried. They didn't leave him with nothing. They left him with a witness, and that was their first mistake. It was nearly midnight when I found him. The station was mostly empty now. Just a few late buses idling under flickering lights, and 2 security guards sharing a quiet conversation near the entrance. I ran past them, ignoring the ache in my legs, scanning every bench, every shadowed corner, like my life depended on it. Because it did. And then I saw him, tucked beneath a warped plastic bench near the far end of the lot, knees drawn up to his chest, hoodie pulled tight over his head and his backpack clutched like a lifeline. His face was pale, his eyes red-rimmed. One sneaker was untied. His lips moved, whispering something, but I couldn't hear it. "Caleb," I said. He flinched. "Baby, it's me." He looked up slowly, like even that movement cost him, and his eyes met mine with a mixture of confusion and disbelief so raw I couldn't breathe. "Mom." I dropped to my knees in front of him, cupping his face. "I'm here. I'm here now." He didn't cry, not at first. He just looked at me like he was seeing a ghost. Then he asked, "Why did you leave me?" I broke. There's a particular kind of pain that hits when your child thinks you were the one who failed them. It's worse than guilt. It's worse than anger. It's annihilation. It's your heart cracking in real time inside your chest. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, Caleb, I didn't. I would never." "But they said—" He started, then stopped. "They said you knew, that it was part of the trip, that it was like a test." My stomach turned to acid. Who said that I asked already knowing the answer? Grayson, Brielle. They gave me the envelope and said we were playing a game. That you agreed, that I just had to figure it out. And then what? He looked down. Then they left. They said the driver would come back, but he didn't. I waited. "How long?" "I don't know," he whispered. "Forever." I pulled him into my arms. He didn't resist. He collapsed against me like something hollowed out, shivering despite the warm night. His hands gripped the back of my jacket like if he let go, the world might end. "I'm so sorry," I said into his hair. "They lied to you. I didn't know. I would never have let this happen." He didn't respond. He just kept holding on. I sat there for a while on that filthy concrete curb, rocking my son back and forth as buses hissed and departed in the distance. Time blurred. I stopped caring who saw us. I stopped caring about anything except the fact that I had found him and he was alive, and even if I had to set the entire world on fire, I would make sure this never happened again. Eventually his breathing slowed. He was still clutching that fake passport, now crumpled and damp with sweat. I took it gently from his hand. "We're going back to the hotel," I said, "and tomorrow we fix this." He pulled back just enough to look at me. "Will they be there?" "I don't care," I said. "They don't matter right now. You do." "But they're our family." I cupped his cheek. "Not anymore." He didn't argue. We got into a cab silent, except for the occasional sniffle. I wrapped my arm around his shoulder, and he leaned into me like he was remembering how. By the time we reached the resort, the staff was waiting. I had called ahead, told them to prepare a quiet room, food, water, first aid. The manager himself met us at the door, his expression grim. "Ms. Matthews," he said gently, "we have your suite ready. The embassy has been notified. We're here to support whatever comes next." I nodded, exhausted. "Thank you." Caleb didn't speak as we entered the elevator. He just watched the numbers rise, his eyes glassy. When the doors opened, he whispered, "I kept thinking you were coming. I kept telling myself, any minute now she's gonna be here." "I'm here now," I said, "and I'm never letting you go again." The room was quiet. Too quiet. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on, staring at the wall. And I realized something watching him. The damage was already done. It wasn't just that he'd been left. It was that he believed for at least part of the day that I had been in on it, that I might have agreed to abandon him, that his mother, the one person who had stood by him every day of his life, had chosen to let go. And that seed of doubt once planted was not going to disappear just because I showed up. It had taken root. They did that. They chose to do that. Not by accident, not in a moment of panic, on purpose. And in that moment, as I sat beside my son and watched him try to process something no child should ever experience, I understood something with a clarity so sharp it nearly split me in two. This family wasn't just toxic. They were dangerous. And from now on, every breath I took, every step I made would be in the service of protecting Caleb from them, no matter what it cost me. They had made their move. Now it was my turn. The call wasn't a conversation. It was a moment of exposure, his, not mine. I waited until Caleb had fallen asleep. He was curled beside me in the hotel bed, body still trembling in small waves like the fear hadn't fully exited his muscles yet. One hand clung to the hem of my sweatshirt in his sleep, as if I could vanish again if he loosened his grip. I reached for the nightstand, turned my phone over slowly, and stared at Derek's name in my contact list. My hand hovered, thumb trembling. Then I pressed record and dialed. It rang twice. Liana. Derek answered too casually. Like I was calling to check the weather. I figured you'd ring. How's our little wanderer? I didn't respond. He laughed. Actually laughed. Come on, sis. Don't tell me you're still in full meltdown mode. Kid's fine, isn't he? You left him, I said flatly. You left a 14-year-old boy alone in a foreign country without real identification, without support. You told him I agreed to it. You watched him walk away. Oh, relax. His tone was drenched in mockery. It wasn't the jungle, Lee. It was a train station. Millions of people use those every day. He had no money, Derek. He had that envelope, with fake currency. Well, he chuckled again, lesson in exchange rates, I guess. I closed my eyes, forcing down the bile. Why would you do this to him? What did he ever do to deserve that kind of cruelty? Cruelty. His voice hardened. God, you're dramatic. You really haven't changed at all. It's always some trauma narrative with you. Always the victim. Maybe if you stopped coddling the boy, he wouldn't be so spineless. Grayson was riding trains solo by 11. Caleb is not Grayson. He is not your project. He is not your punchline. Oh, come on, he's not broken. He's fine. He needs to toughen up, Liana. We were trying to help. You tried to teach a child a lesson by terrifying him. A pause. And then he'll remember it, won't he? Maybe now he won't be so soft. I didn't even feel the phone in my hand anymore. I was floating somewhere outside my own body, watching myself keep calm while everything inside me screamed. Where's Leona? I asked. Another voice appeared on the line. Hi, Liana. Her voice cool and practiced, still holding on to that righteous fury I see. You left my son alone in a transportation hub with a fake passport and a $5 bill. Oh, don't be so theatrical. We didn't leave him in a war zone. It was a test, a little growth exercise. He's 14. Exactly. Old enough to start learning the world doesn't revolve around his mother's anxiety. I could hear her smirking through the speaker. You're unbelievable, I said. No, Liana. What's unbelievable is that you still think being overprotective is noble. You've turned him into a mirror of your fear. We gave him something you never could, perspective. You gave him trauma. Semantics, she snapped. He's safe now, right? He'll get over it. I stared at the ceiling. My fingers never moved from the record button. You really think you did the right thing, I said, stunned. Oh, don't twist this. Derek broke in again. You should be thanking us. Kid needed to be shaken up. And now he has. You're welcome. I ended the call. No warning, no threats. Just silence. And the soft beep as the recording stopped. I sat there in that hotel room with the ocean breeze trying to push through the thick curtains, and I felt something change in me. A click. like the slow turn of a lock that had been stuck for years. They thought they were invincible, so sure of themselves, so protected by their money and smiles and suburban charm. They thought they could define the narrative just like they always had. That I'd cry, get mad, maybe avoid them for a year, then show back up for Thanksgiving because that's what family does. But this wasn't family. This was calculated, callous, and finally undeniably criminal. And now I had proof. I transferred the recording to my secure cloud account, labeled it with a timestamp, and backed it up on 2 separate drives. Then I wrote a summary of the entire conversation word for word just in case. Because this was no longer about confrontation. This was the beginning of a case. I walked back to the bed, sat down slowly, and stroked Caleb's hair as he slept. "You won't have to fear them again," I whispered. "I promise you, never again." By the time the embassy van pulled up to the resort, Caleb had fallen asleep again this time, with his head in my lap, his breath soft and fragile, like he hadn't fully decided whether the world was safe enough to exhale in. The drive had been silent. Neither of us had words left after the night we'd survived. Only silence and a quiet rage coiled behind my ribs, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The embassy representative was a woman named Nicole. American early 40s calm, in that way you only become after seeing too much. She didn't ask questions at first, just looked at Caleb, then at me, and nodded once. "Let's get you upstairs." The embassy had arranged for a temporary safe room at the resort in a separate building from the rest of my family. Security had already been notified not to disclose our new location to anyone, including relatives. Nicole walked us in, set down her briefcase, and pulled out a thin black folder. "I want to start by saying, this is serious," she said. "What happened to your son isn't just emotionally traumatic. It may qualify as a violation of international child protection laws." I nodded, throat tight. "I need you to say that again." Slowly. She met my eyes. "This is more than just a bad parenting decision. You have grounds to open a formal case under the Hague Convention Child Endangerment Abandonment and the use of falsified documentation." I had never heard the word Hague used in relation to my life before. It felt like stepping into a courtroom I hadn't known I was walking toward. Nicole continued, "If you want to move forward, we'll help you start the paperwork. We'll also notify the State Department in D.C. They may reach out to follow up. This will cross borders." Caleb stirred. I pulled a blanket higher over him. "Will it hurt him?" I asked. "Legally, I mean." She shook her head. "He's the victim here. His name won't be public unless you choose to pursue it in the media." "I'm not sure yet," I said. "But I know I want a record. I want this to exist in a system that can't pretend it didn't happen." Nicole smiled sadly, knowingly. That's a good place to start. When she left, I closed the door, drew the curtains, and exhaled for the first time in hours. I sat down on the edge of the couch and opened my laptop, and I began to write. Not a blog, not a post, a document. Cold, chronological, surgical. Timeline of incident. Matthews, Caleb, Southeast Asia. I wrote it like a lawyer would. 7:40 a.m. Caleb observed leaving hotel with Derek and Liana. 8:12 a.m. Security confirms van. 10:42 a.m. Video footage from station Caleb alone in possession of falsified passport. 2:18 p.m. SMS from Caleb. Think they left me. 9:11 p.m. Caleb located at public bus terminal. I included audio logs, notes from the front desk manager, a copy of the fake passport scanned into PDF. Then I opened another tab and started a private journal. Not for court, for me. He asked me why I left him. He believed them. For hours he believed them. How do I undo that kind of betrayal? How do I convince him I'm still his safe place? I typed for 45 minutes without stopping. After that, I emailed the law office back in New York I'd used during my divorce. The receptionist responded in less than 10 minutes. We'll connect you to a partner with experience in international family litigation. The partner's name was Aaron Patel. I scheduled the consultation for 2 days out, first available. Then I opened a new browser tab. Media Strategy Consultants for High-Conflict Family Matters. Reputation Defense. Narrative Recovery. The list was longer than I expected. I wasn't planning to go public. Not yet. But I wanted the option. I wanted a folder full of names, numbers, and contracts. I wanted a war chest even if I never opened it. I chose a woman named Cynthia Liang, a former journalist turned communications strategist. Her tagline read, "Your truth, your timing, our protection." That felt right. I booked a 30-minute call. Left a brief summary in the comment field. Mother seeking guidance after minor child was abandoned by family members overseas, considering legal and media responses. It didn't matter that it was 3 a.m. local time. The world was already turning toward morning somewhere else. When I finally closed the laptop, the sky outside was starting to shift from black to a deep, uncertain blue. The kind of color that sits between night and day, between silence and confrontation. Caleb stirred again. This time when his eyes opened, he looked around and said softly, "Did they call?" "No," I said. "And they won't. Not because they care, not unless they think they've been exposed." He didn't ask what that meant. Instead, he nodded once. "Then, are we safe here?" I looked him in the eyes. "We are now." And in that moment, I didn't feel like a scared mother anymore. I felt like a witness preparing her testimony, a strategist sharpening her blade. The fury hadn't passed. It had just learned how to organize itself. By the time the plane touched down at JFK, Caleb had fallen into the kind of sleep only trauma can deliver, deep, dreamless, and far too quiet for a 14-year-old. I didn't wake him as we taxied. I just watched the gray clouds curl above the runway like they had something to say, but didn't dare speak it aloud. I wasn't going home. Not yet. My phone buzzed as soon as we connected to the terminal's Wi-Fi. 37 unread messages. 12 missed calls. All from the same 3 people, Derek, Leona, and my mother. But the name that sat at the top of my inbox like a snake coiled in the sun? Subject: "Please don't blow this out of proportion for Dad's sake." It was from Derek. He wrote like nothing had happened. No apology, no acknowledgement, just lines about protecting the family's image and how Dad's retirement banquet was in a few weeks, and how it would mean the world if we could just keep things private for now. Private! The word throbbed in my chest like a bruise. Private was how they'd left my son in a foreign station. Private was how they forged a passport and walked away like nothing mattered. Private was how they expected me to swallow it all again. I closed the message. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened another email, one I'd drafted somewhere over the Pacific, between a sleepless sky and the quiet hum of an air mask above my seat. It was addressed to Eleanor Bishop, a retired editor who once told me over coffee, "One day you're going to write something that burns the world down but leaves something beautiful in the ashes." I hadn't spoken to her in 7 years, but I remembered her card. Still kept it tucked behind Caleb's ultrasound in the zippered pouch of my wallet. Subject: "The story I never thought I'd have to write." Attachment chapters 1 to 3. Draft the family table. I hit send. The file contained 30 pages, enough to crack the facade, not enough to reveal names. Not yet. Just a portrait in shadows, a mother, a boy, and a family who believed that shame was discipline and silence was loyalty. I closed my laptop and looked out the car window. The city had barely woken up, but the streets still pulsed with life. Taxis' horns steam rising from grates like ghosts with unfinished business. Caleb stirred beside me. "You hungry?" I asked softly. He shook his head, then added, "I don't want to go to Grandma's." "We're not," I said. "I booked a place downtown, just us." He nodded once, then leaned his head back against the glass. I watched him for a moment, my son who had looked for me in a crowd that never came. My son who now looked older than he had a week ago. When we arrived, I tucked him in and made tea, but I didn't sit. I opened my laptop again, went into private mode, and created a new account. Burning family tree, no bio, no photo, no links, just a single banner image, a long empty dinner table with 10 untouched plates and 1 seat missing. Then I posted the first excerpt. They called themselves generous. They fed you guilt and called it tradition. They set your place at the table just to measure how much of yourself you'd swallow to stay there. But the moment you stopped nodding, they served silence for dessert. No hashtags, no tags, just text. It took 15 minutes for the first comment. Ghost daughter, who gave you access to my life. By the end of the hour, there were 40 reposts, 100 likes. More comments than I could answer. I didn't need them to know it was me. Not yet. But I needed them to know someone was watching. That someone had lived it, survived it, and wasn't afraid to call it what it was. This wasn't revenge. It was resurrection, in slow motion. The kind that begins not with fire, but with the first match struck in a quiet room. I sat there for a long time, sipping cold tea, watching the screen blink back at me. One post. One wound opened with precision, and the echo of a brother's email still haunting my drafts folder. Please don't blow this out of proportion. For Dad's sake. He should have worried about Caleb's sake. He should have worried about mine. But he didn't. And now the story had already begun. And this time I was the one writing it. The post didn't go viral overnight. It took 36 hours. By the time I checked the anonymous account again, the second post, an excerpt about a child left in a foreign country by people who claimed to love him, had over 90,000 views. And then came the emails, not from strangers, from survivors, from daughters, sons, ex-wives, forgotten nephews, people who'd been told for decades to sit down, shut up, and be grateful for the roof over their heads, even if that roof leaked guilt and humiliation. They flooded my inbox with quiet, aching truth. You're telling my story. My aunt left me at a train station when I was 8. They still laugh about it at family gatherings. I thought I imagined it, that maybe I overreacted. And under each message, always the same haunting line, thank you for naming it. I hadn't revealed names yet, but I didn't have to, because the patterns were universal. And monsters don't need surnames, they wear smiles. By the end of the second day, a journalist from The Atlantic reached out. Then a producer from a major morning talk show. I said yes to the second one, not because I craved a spotlight, I hated cameras, but because I needed a stage that couldn't be silenced. We filmed in New York. The studio smelled like overbrewed coffee and nerves. They gave me makeup, a calm room, and a paper cup of mint tea I never touched. Then they wired me with a mic, ushered me onto a stage, and said 5 minutes until live. The host smiled warmly. We've never had a guest post anonymously and break through this fast, she said. You struck a nerve. I gave a tight smile. Nerves break easier than bones, I said quietly. And they take longer to heal. We went live. And for 7 minutes, I didn't blink. I told the story in pieces, no names, just wait. A child, a train station, a forged passport, a lie told over generations that family always knows best. I ended with this. There's a difference between discipline and cruelty, between tradition and manipulation. Family doesn't mean immunity, and blood doesn't mean permission. When the lights went down, the host reached over and squeezed my hand. Her knuckles trembled. You just made a lot of people feel sane for the first time in years. I nodded. I didn't cry. That would come later. On the way home, my phone wouldn't stop vibrating. The account had crossed 300,000 followers. Someone had posted a Reddit thread identifying possible connections to the Matthews family of Massachusetts, and one local paper dug up my father's career history trying to connect dots. I didn't respond. I let it brew. But then came the letter. It arrived by certified mail. Heavy cream envelope, no return address. Inside was a single sheet typed in Times New Roman. Dear Liana, cease immediately your defamatory behavior. You have 24 hours to remove all digital content referring to our family or face legal consequences. You have twisted facts and incited harassment. For the sake of our parents' health and dignity, let this drop. We have lawyers. We are prepared to use them. Derek Matthews. It ended with a digital signature. No sincerely, no love. Just a threat wrapped in shame. I read it once, then again, then laughed out loud. Not because it wasn't terrifying, it was, but because Derek still thought this was about him. He thought this was a performance. He had no idea that I had already assembled a full legal portfolio, screenshots of text messages, copies of Caleb's fake passport, testimony from embassy staff, the voice recording of his callous laughter, the note Caleb found in the envelope, "Learn to survive. Don't be your mother." It was all dated, stored, and sealed. I'd already spoken to 2 international lawyers and a former prosecutor specialized in child endangerment. They'd confirmed what I hoped I wasn't on trial. They were. I didn't take down a single word. Instead, I posted a new excerpt. This one from Chapter 5 of my manuscript. It didn't mention names, but it did mention a brother who once forced a child to sit outside in winter to learn character, and a mother who called it necessary. It ended with this: abuse that wears the mask of legacy is the hardest kind to unlearn because it speaks your name and calls itself love. That night, the post hit national press. The next morning, the family table was trending globally. And somewhere in the thick of all that digital noise, Caleb looked up at me from across the breakfast table and said, "Mom, are we safe?" I looked at him, at the bruise behind his eyes the world hadn't seen. And I said, "We're not hiding anymore. That's safer than we've ever been." The courthouse smelled of polished wood and worn-out patience. It was real now, no longer words on a screen or whispers in inboxes, no longer threats sent from ivory towers in cream-colored envelopes. This was concrete, documented, filed, signed. Liana Matthews v. Derek and Liana Matthews. Charge abandonment of a minor with intent to cause emotional distress. A felony under federal and international child protection laws. It took everything in me not to shake as I handed the paperwork to the clerk. But I didn't. I held steady. Because now my fear had shape and shape could be dismantled. My attorney, Cynthia Hale, slid the folder closed with the precision of a woman who'd spent 20 years destroying people like my brother in court. "They're going to fight this like their names are at stake," she said quietly. I looked her in the eyes. They are. The case made news within 48 hours. Not because the Matthews name was famous, but because of the precedent. It wasn't every day a single mother took her entire upper-middle-class family to court for abandoning a child. And the press loved the irony. Family values turned inside out. Train station justice. One mother's legal stand. Abuse in a cardigan. The Matthews PR team responded with what they knew best. Silence followed by smoke. They painted me as unstable. A woman scorned. Someone who twisted stories for attention. But the public had read my words, and more importantly, they'd read Caleb's. Because 3 days after the suit was filed, my son asked me something I'll never forget. "Can I talk to?" He said it like a whisper, like a question not meant to be answered. I said yes, and he did. He wrote a letter. His first public statement. It was 3 paragraphs printed in 12-point font, and signed in uneven handwriting that hadn't yet recovered from the tremble of that station floor. He asked to read it at the preliminary hearing. The court allowed it. It was quiet that day. So quiet you could hear every shift in the wooden benches, every shallow breath, every anxious cough from the back of the gallery. And then Caleb stood. The bailiff swore him in. His hands shook, but he didn't cry. He looked at the judge, then at Derek and Liana, both in ironed suits, both pretending not to know fear, and began, "My name is Caleb Matthews. I'm 14 years old. 3 months ago, I was taken away from my hotel by my uncle and aunt. They smiled and said we were going on an adventure, but they left me at a train station, in a country where I didn't speak the language, with no phone, no passport, and no way to get home. I wasn't lost, I was left. Not by strangers, but by family. And that's what hurt the most. I saw Liana twitch. I saw Derek shift his jaw. But Caleb didn't flinch. He ended with a line that turned every head in that room. I wasn't abandoned by people who didn't love me. I was abandoned by people who said they did. The judge didn't interrupt, no one did. And when Caleb sat down, the silence afterward wasn't just quiet. It was reverent. Because truth doesn't scream, it echoes. The defense tried to argue that it was a misunderstanding, a cultural misjudgment, a lapse in parenting, that Caleb was never in serious danger. But we had the footage. We had the passport. We had the envelope. We had the recorded call. Derek's voice laughing Leona's sneer. It's not like we left him in the jungle. And now we had the boy. The court accepted the case into full proceedings. They would stand trial. Outside reporters waited like vultures. But this time I didn't run. I didn't hide. I stood beside my son as he held my hand and faced the cameras. He didn't smile, but he stood tall. And for the first time since that station bench, I saw light come back to his eyes. Not because justice had been served, but because we'd finally named the crime. The therapy room smelled faintly of lavender and hope. Caleb sat on the soft beige couch legs, dangling hands nervously twisting the edge of a pillow. Across from him, Dr. Harper, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an unshakable calm, nodded gently, waiting for him to find the words. It wasn't easy, not at first. Months ago, the thought of opening up was unimaginable. But step by step, breath by breath, Caleb began to unravel the tangled web inside him. I'm scared, he said one day, voice cracking. Not just of what happened, but of what might happen next. Fear is the first step toward healing, Dr. Harper replied softly. It means you're ready to face the unknown. Liana watched from the doorway, heart tightening and loosening all at once. For years, she had carried her own scars, silent, hidden beneath smiles and responsibilities. Now, watching Caleb navigate his, she learned what real strength looked like. They were healing together. Not perfectly, not linearly, but moving forward. Liana made a conscious choice not to block Caleb's contact with his grandparents. It was complicated. There were memories, voices, and shadows that only time could soften. But she believed in boundaries, not barricades. She told Caleb, you can talk to them, but I'm here to help you decide when and how. Caleb nodded, feeling the weight of control returning to his hands. One afternoon, after a particularly tough session, Liana sat at her kitchen table with a stack of notebooks, legal papers, and a steaming cup of coffee. She tapped her pen thoughtfully. Her voice, steady but resolute, broke the silence. This isn't just about us anymore. She drafted a mission statement, a blueprint, a vision for something bigger than survival. A sanctuary for children like Caleb. Children abandoned not by strangers, but by those meant to protect them. A place where stories could be told without shame. Where brokenness could be met with care, not judgment. Where healing wasn't a destination, but a journey walked hand in hand. She reached out to counselors, social workers, and advocates. She secured funding grants and community partnerships. And with every phone call, every meeting, the center took shape. A beacon, a promise. A revolution born from pain and fierce love. Caleb, sitting beside her in the quiet of their living room, smiled for the first time in months. Mom, he said softly, we're going to help a lot of kids, aren't we? She squeezed his hand. Yes, baby, we are. And in that moment, the past didn't feel so heavy. Because the future was theirs to write. Together. The courtroom was thick with tension, a pressure so dense it seemed to press down on every breath, every heartbeat. Derek sat at the defendant's table, face pale and clenched eyes darting nervously toward the judge as the final verdict was read aloud. Due to proven abandonment and emotional endangerment of a minor, this court hereby rules to restrict Derek Matthews' custody rights. He will retain supervised visitation only pending further psychological evaluation. Additionally, he is ordered to pay reparations for emotional distress and associated damages. A collective silence fell. For Derek, the weight of loss was palpable. The public stripping away of his perceived control, the legal acknowledgement that his actions had real consequences. No longer just family drama, it was a civil judgment with teeth. Liana, sitting beside him, remained defiantly silent. When pressed during the hearing about an apology, she refused outright, her icy stare cutting through the room like a blade. The court hereby prohibits Liana Matthews from any contact with Caleb Matthews, effective immediately and permanently, the judge declared. That line hung in the air like a guillotine's blade, final and irrevocable. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like lightning storms, capturing every look, every word spoken by lawyers and by me. But inside, a far more intimate drama was unfolding. Later that evening, my parents sat across from me in the dim light of the family home we hadn't visited since the fallout. Their eyes, red-rimmed and glassy, told stories of heartbreak, of silent tears shed in solitude, of a family breaking apart in ways no one wanted to name. My father's voice cracked. "Liana, we never wanted this." My mother, wiping her cheeks, nodded. "We were blind. We didn't see the pain." I looked at them not with anger, but with a solemn clarity that felt heavier than any fury. "No," I said, "we're not a family anymore, not like before." They blinked. "We're shards now," I continued. "Pieces forced apart by choices made long ago, each responsible for their own healing, their own truths. We don't get to pretend this never happened. We don't get to rebuild on lies." My voice grew steadier. "This isn't an end, it's a transformation." My parents reached for each other's hands, a fragile lifeline. "I hope one day we can be something new. But that day isn't today." They nodded acceptance mingled with grief. I returned to Caleb's side, feeling a strange peace settle over us both. Because while the family we knew had shattered, the family we needed was being forged stronger, truer, and born from courage. And that more than anything was our beginning. The grand opening of Boundaries First was more than just a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a declaration, a promise etched in glass and steel that no child would ever again have to learn survival in silence. The room buzzed with energy, parents clutching tear-streaked hands, counselors swapping stories of breakthrough moments, and children whose eyes held stories too heavy for their years. Caleb stood at the podium, his voice steady, carrying across the crowd like a beacon. "If no one protects you," he said, "then you have to become the one who does." His words weren't just a mantra, they were a lifeline. For every family grappling with scars hidden beneath polite smiles, for every child abandoned in the shadows of perfect homes. The center had already supported over 120 families in its first year. Each story a thread woven into a larger tapestry of healing and resilience. And then a letter arrived from a young girl named Mia who had found Liana's memoir tucked away in a public library's dusty shelf. She wrote of loneliness, of being left behind, of a voice too small to be heard. Her words trembled with hope and fear. Liana read the letter late into the night and made a decision that transformed the center from a sanctuary into a movement. Mia came to Boundaries First, her hands shaking, but her spirit ignited by the knowledge that someone somewhere understood. And in that moment, the circle of healing began. Not with grand gestures, not with loud declarations, but with the quiet courage of a single girl finding her way home. And with Caleb now standing tall, not just as a survivor, but as a guardian of light born from the darkest wounds. Together they weren't just healing, they were rewriting the story, one boundary at a time. The knock on the door was hesitant, almost tentative, like the sound of a ghost, unsure if it was welcome. I opened it to find Derek standing there, suit slightly rumpled, eyes bloodshot from what I could only assume were sleepless nights. He looked older. Not just in years, but in the weight he carried, the kind that no amount of wealth or pride could mask. "Liana," he began, voice cracking beneath the effort to sound steady. "Please, I'm begging you. Don't let this destroy us. We're family, we're siblings. There has to be a way back. Please keep what we have." I looked at him. The man who had orchestrated the most painful betrayal of my life, who had watched my son stand alone at a foreign train station, who'd thought abandonment was a lesson and cruelty a tradition. But I saw something else too. The flicker of a man scared to lose everything, clinging to a past that was already gone. "Derek," I said softly, stepping aside just enough to let him in. "Blood isn't a shield." He looked confused. "Family doesn't grant immunity from consequences. Not for what you did, not for the pain you caused." He swallowed hard. "Liana, please, we can fix this. We can move forward." I shook my head. "No. There is no moving forward if it means ignoring the harm done. I've spent years living with the weight of your choices, years protecting Caleb from the fallout you caused." He took a step closer, desperation seeping through his polished facade. "You're making a mistake. We can be whole again." I met his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm not interested in pretending anymore. I'm interested in truth, healing. And that means setting boundaries that protect us." For a moment, silence stretched a fragile thread between what was and what could never be again. Then I turned, not with bitterness, not with rage, but with the quiet strength of someone who had chosen her path and was ready to walk it no matter how long or hard. As the door closed behind me, I felt the final weight lift. Because sometimes the hardest freedom is the courage to walk away from the past and step into the life you were always meant to live. The afternoon sun filtered softly through the wide porch windows, casting gentle patterns on the worn wooden floor where Liana and Caleb sat side by side. A dog-eared book lay open in her hands, the pages rustling quietly in the breeze. Caleb's laughter, light and unguarded, floated across the yard, mixing with the distant hum of life slowly reclaiming itself. This was a world rebuilt not from illusions or false promises, but from hard-won truths and the courage to choose light over darkness. Liana looked down at Caleb, her heart full but steady. The scars remained etched deep like roots beneath their feet, but they no longer defined their story. Instead, they marked where the healing had begun. Her voice, soft but clear, broke the peaceful silence. "Family isn't who you're born to," she said. "It's who chooses not to leave you stranded on the side of the road." Caleb nodded, eyes bright, clutching her hand like a lifeline tethered to hope. The screen faded slowly to black, and the words appeared stark and resonant. "If you have ever survived betrayal by those closest to you, you are not alone." The final frame lingered, a call to arms in quiet prose. "If this story touched you, share it, so no one else has to walk that road alone." The credits rolled alongside the logo of Boundaries First, the sanctuary born from pain, now a beacon for those seeking refuge. The screen dimmed, but the light it ignited would burn long after the story ended. Because some wounds carve the deepest paths, but the journey back to the light is the most powerful story of all.